All right, guys, so today I wanted to talk about starting a new session. All right, guys, so I actually got a request for this video topic, so I hope you guys like this. I hope it helps some of you guys. It is a more beginner topic, so I know some of you guys are more advanced and you might not need to watch this video. I don't know. I am going to go a little bit more in depth with how the logic behind some of these decisions. So maybe it'll help some of you guys anyway. I don't know. But anyway, let's start talking about starting a new session. So basically, I already have Pro Tools up and running here. So that is something I recommend doing before actually going to start a new session. And you can see that it's up and running, right? Because there's a dot down here. But basically, it's a little bit safer to start up Pro Tools before you actually create the new session. It's just a little bit less likely to crash when you start up the software. I know that's not like the most encouraging thing to hear, but it's true, you know, so it's good to start things up before you either create a new session or open a new session. So that is one thing that I recommend doing, just starting up Pro Tools before you actually then open or create a new session. So to create a new session, you can either do Command N or you can go up here to File and go to Create New. So you do need to have either clicked on Pro Tools down here or either if you do Command Tab to toggle between different programs on your computer, then that's one way to do it. But basically, you do want to go to where you're actually in Pro Tools so that you can actually get to this File menu and then Create New. Okay, so I'm going to focus on just creating a new session here. So I'm not going to go into templates or anything like that. But basically, what you want to do when you create a new session is you want to name your session. So I'm going to be like episode, what are we on? 118 maybe? Example session here. And then I'm going to do local storage. So all that means is that it's storing the actual session on your computer, right? You're not storing it in the cloud, which would be like the projects tab. You can access cloud stuff from there. I'm actually storing it on my computer, so local storage. And again, I'm not going over the template thing here. I might have a video on templates already. If I do, I will put them up on the screen in the form of a card at the top. But I'm not covering that today. I'm just going to talk about the basics of these concepts down here. So if you did choose to do a template, that's what this whole section of the screen is. But since we're not doing it, we can just ignore this whole part here. So now you get down to where we have the file type option. So it's either WAV or AFF. And basically both of these file types are really good file types. They're both high quality. Either one that you choose is going to be pretty good, right? So I don't think it makes a huge difference which one you pick here. I do believe one was more compatible for just Macs, and then the other one was more compatible across platforms. I believe AFF was more compatible across platforms. But nowadays, pretty much any computer can play either of these. It's not much of an issue. And they're both high quality file types. I do see people in studios using WAV a lot more. So that's why I actually use WAV. Just to be part of the group, I guess. I don't know. But either one of these you choose is going to be a good option here. Then you have the sample rate option, right? So depending on what I'm doing, I'm going to pick a different sample rate. But basically, the thing to remember with sample rate, and I have videos on sample rate and bit depth that I will put up on the screen as I go along here. I'll put cards up on the screen to those. But basically, the thing to remember with sample rate is that the higher the sample rate, it's going to take more data storage, right? So if you're concerned about how much data storage, or if you're concerned about how much CPU your computer is using, higher values here are going to bog down your computer a bit more. So that's something to keep in mind. But the higher the sample rate, the more accurately your frequencies are going to be recreated. And so the why behind that, I believe I went into in my video that covers sample rate. So I'll put that at the top of the screen. But that's just something to keep in mind. 44.1 kilohertz was the standard for CDs. CDs are kind of more than outdated now, and they're on their way out. So I personally never choose 44.1. It's kind of a low sample rate anyway. Sometimes I will choose 48 kilohertz. That's sometimes considered more of the standard for film. Although, you know, when we're working in film, when we're working to do sound design for film, a lot of times we will work in a higher sample rate. And then depending on what the format is that the actual client wants as a final format, then we might downsample it to 48 kilohertz. So that's just something to keep in mind. But I do sometimes work just in 48 kilohertz, like when I'm doing something for my YouTube videos, for example, I'll work in 48 kilohertz because I'm pretty sure YouTube modifies my audio a little bit, and I don't see the point in making a super high quality audio file for something on YouTube when I'm just conveying concepts to you guys. You know, the quality of how you hear my voice isn't super important, right? So usually what I'm working in is usually 96 kilohertz if I'm working in music. It's a bit higher quality. It's actually twice 48 kilohertz, right? So if I want to downsample to 48 kilohertz, the math is a bit simpler for the computer. You're a little less likely to have some artifacts in your downsample. Not a huge concern, to be honest, but it's something to think about. Some people will work in 88.2. It's all just a preference thing. But again, the thing to keep in mind with sample rate is the higher the sample rate, the more accurately your frequencies are going to be recreated. And then also the more storage space and the more intensive it's going to be on your computer. So I usually work in 96 kilohertz when I'm working on music. So I'm just going to leave it here at that. But it's totally up to you guys. Usually any of these options are going to sound good. You know, we don't have sample rates in Pro Tools that are so low that it sounds junky, right? As we go to really low sample rates, we're going to start losing those high frequencies. So you'll actually hear some of the frequencies start to drop out if you ever run one of those tests where you take audio and you reduce the sample rate. And there are actually other videos on YouTube, I might link to them in the description below, that have examples of audio that's been downsampled to a really low sample rate. So I'll link to one of those in the description below that I show my students, just so you can get an idea of how that sample rate can affect that frequency recreation, right? And I say recreation because it's in the switch from analog to digital, right? So when we go from analog, which is variations in voltage, into digital, that's when we take samples. And that's how we recreate that analog audio in a digital form. And the other thing to keep in mind for sample rate in terms of storage space is that if you double the sample rate, so 44.1, if I double that and make it 88.2, for example, it's literally going to take twice as much room to store that data, right? So it's literally doubling the amount of samples you're taking. So it's literally doubling the amount of data that's involved in storing that audio. So that's just something to keep in mind that'll help you kind of figure out how much data is going to be involved in this stuff. But for now, I'm going to stick with 96 kilohertz, and let's talk about bit depth. So bit depth, I always just pick the highest value here. Storage space on computers isn't as much of an issue as it used to be, right? So that's kind of the logic behind why I pick the highest value here, because I'm not worried about storage space. Storage space would be the biggest concern. And so basically the cliff notes here on bit depth is that the higher value you pick for bit depth, then the better, the more accurate the dynamic range is going to be. And I have a video that talks about bit depth in more detail, so I will link to that with a card at the top of the screen here. I think I have enough cards left. But basically, all you need to know is the dynamic range is, the outer limits of the dynamic range are going to be the same, but if you have a higher bit depth versus a lower bit depth, the higher bit depth is going to have more accuracy within that dynamic range. It's especially good, you know, if you're doing something like symphony work where the dynamic range of the symphony is very important, then it is good to have a higher bit depth. But again, you know, all these values that we get in Pro Tools are pretty good. So it's not like it's going to sound super junky if you reduce it. It's just going to be a little bit better quality if you have it higher. So that's why I choose the higher value here. So then you get to the I/O settings. So I/O stands for input output. And usually I just stick with last used, especially if you're working in a home studio or you're working in any kind of studio that kind of has a more permanent setup. A lot of times you'll just end up using whatever the last used settings are here. But you can switch to different types of settings, and Pro Tools has some defaults here for different interfaces. So if I wanted to switch over to using my 11 rack instead of my Apollo here, then I might want to then switch my I/O settings here to the 11 rack, just so those defaults are there and I don't have to manually switch my I/O settings once I get into my session. So pretty much, I'd say 99.9% of the time, I'm just doing last used here. So I would just leave that there. Again, it's up to you. It depends on what you're doing. And then we have the interleaved option. So I always check this off, but I don't know if it makes a huge difference whether or not you check it off. So basically, when we're talking about audio, interleaved, all that means is if you have a stereo audio file, it's going to, if you then import that stereo audio file, it's going to then preserve that stereo audio file as one file. So one file that has the left and the right channel interleaved together. So if you don't have this checked off and you import a stereo audio file, basically what it's going to do is it's going to create one. In this example, I have WAV files as my default, right? So it's going to create one WAV file that's the left channel and one WAV file that's the right channel. And that's because that's kind of how Pro Tools deals with stereo files, right? But if you check off interleaved, then it will store those stereo files in your audio files folder as interleaved stereo files. So it'll be one file with left and right interleaved together. So I like checking this off just because if I then decide I want to move something like out of my audio files folder, or for, it's pretty rare that this actually comes up, but I just like the idea that I'm not going to accidentally separate that left and right channel. It's kind of more of a weird paranoia thing than anything, but I like that idea that it's keeping them interleaved together, because usually when we import a stereo file, we do want to keep them together to some extent. And you can still then within Pro Tools separate them out if you really want to separate them out onto separate tracks. And I have a video about that, about how to separate a stereo track out into two mono tracks. So I'll put a card if I have any left at the top here, if you're curious about how that's done. But yeah, that's kind of just the logic behind why I check off interleaved. It doesn't make a huge difference for your session. It doesn't change the quality of the audio as far as I know, but that's why I do it. So then the last thing here is you just want to look at the location option here, and you want to make sure that it's saving your session in the location that you actually want it to save the session. So it usually defaults to wherever the last location was. So I literally right before this just recorded my ADR recording episode. So that's what it's defaulting to. So I'm going to want to switch this over, right? So I might make this go to my desktop, because I'm going to delete this afterwards, I'm pretty sure. So I'm going to hit open. And there we go. So now my location is set, and you can see it right here. And that's basically it for this window. And then all you want to do is hit create. All right, guys, so it's Cato from the future. I'm sorry. It looks like my QuickTime player cut off my last screen capture. So I just wanted to jump in here. I think it was pretty much done anyway. I had finished. I was about to do my outro. So I figured I'd jump in here and say bye. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you guys found this useful. As always, let me know what you think in the comments below. All that stuff. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I come out with new videos. That one really helps YouTubers, so I would really appreciate that. And if you do want to support my channel more directly, I do have a Patreon, so it's patreon.com/CatoNoise, and my patrons do get access to additional content. So that's about it. I come out with new videos every Wednesday, and thank you for watching. Okay. Just thinking if I forgot anything here.